The rain hit the small metal ship like bullets from the sky. Inside, Zara gripped the controls with hands that shook from fear and exhaustion. Her child, Coda, sat behind her, strapped into a seat that was too big for his small frame. The boys' eyes were wide with terror as their ship spun through the dark clouds above Earth. "Hold on tight, my love," Zara whispered, her voice barely heard over the screaming wind outside. She had been flying for 3 days straight, running from those who wanted to take her son away. Now, with fuel running low and systems failing, one by one, Earth was their only chance. The ship's warning lights flashed red, casting an eerie glow across their faces. Zara looked at the damaged control panel and felt her heart sink. The navigation system was broken. The shields were gone. Even the emergency landing systems had stopped working hours ago. She was flying blind through a storm that seemed to want to tear their tiny vessel apart. "Mama, I'm scared," Coda said, his voice small and trembling. The child had special abilities that made him different from others of their kind. Back on their home planet, some people saw these gifts as dangerous. That's why they had to run. That's why they were now falling through an alien sky, hoping to find safety on a world they knew nothing about. Zara reached back and squeezed her son's hand. "We're going to be okay," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "Remember what I taught you about being brave? Sometimes being brave means being scared, but doing what you have to do anyway." The ship lurched suddenly to the right, throwing them both against their seats. Through the small window, Zara could see trees rushing up toward them, big, tall trees that looked nothing like the silver-leafed plants from their home world. These were green and thick, creating a carpet of forest that stretched as far as she could see. She pulled back on the controls, trying to slow their fall, but the ship wouldn't respond. The engines made a grinding sound that told her everything. She needed to know. They were going to crash, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Close your eyes, Coda," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "And remember that no matter what happens, Mama loves you more than all the stars in the sky." The impact came like thunder. The ship hit the first tree, then bounced off 2 more before sliding down a steep hill. Metal scraped against rock and dirt. Glass shattered. Sparks flew from broken wires. The world spun around them in a chaos of sound and motion until finally everything went silent. Zara woke up to the smell of smoke and the sound of rain pattering on the broken hull above her head. Her left arm throbbed with pain, and when she tried to move it, she realized it was probably broken. Blood trickled down her face from a cut on her forehead, but she was alive. More importantly, she could hear Coda breathing behind her. "Coda?" she called softly, afraid of what she might find. When she turned around, she saw her son slumped in his seat, unconscious but breathing steadily. A large bump on his head showed, where he had hit something during the crash, but he didn't seem to be seriously hurt. Zara carefully unbuckled herself and crawled over to check on her child. His pulse was strong, and his breathing was normal. The bump on his head looked worse than it probably was. Still, she knew that head injuries could be tricky, especially for their kind. She needed to wake him up soon to make sure he was really okay. The first thing she noticed when she tried to stand was how cold it was. Their ship's heating system was completely destroyed, and cold air was pouring in through cracks in the hull. Back home, temperatures like this were uncomfortable but manageable. Here, with Coda's special condition, the cold could be deadly. Coda's body worked differently than most of their kind. Where others could handle temperature changes fairly well, he needed consistent warmth to keep his vital systems working properly. It was part of what made him special, but it also made him vulnerable. If his body temperature dropped too much, he could slip into a coma-like state that might be permanent. Zara looked around the wreckage of their ship, taking inventory of what they had left. The communication system was smashed beyond repair. Their food supplies had scattered during the crash, and most of the containers were broken open, their contents spoiled or lost. The emergency beacon that was supposed to call for help was nothing but twisted metal and broken circuits. But the most immediate problem was the cold. She could already see her breath in the air, and Koda's lips were starting to turn a pale blue color that meant his body was struggling to stay warm. She had to do something, and she had to do it fast. Looking through the wreckage, Zara found a few pieces of metal that might burn and some fabric from their torn seats. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She gathered everything she could find that might catch fire and made a small pile in the most sheltered part of the ship. The problem was getting a flame started. Their emergency fire starter had been destroyed in the crash, and she had no other way to create heat. She tried rubbing pieces of metal together, but nothing happened. She tried using the broken wires from the ship's electrical system, but they were dead. Then she looked down at her own clothes. The fabric was specially made to resist fire, but if she could get it hot enough, it would burn. And once it started burning, it would burn hot and long. She had packed 3 changes of clothes for their journey, plus the formal robes she wore for special occasions. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to keep Koda warm until help arrived. The thought of burning her clothes made her stomach turn, not just because it would leave her with nothing to wear, but because some of these clothes held precious memories. The blue robe was the one she had worn when she received her highest scientific honor. The soft scarf had belonged to Koda's father, who had died protecting them during their escape. The simple dress she was wearing now was the one Koda had picked, out for her birthday last year. But when she looked at her son's pale face and saw him shivering even in his unconsciousness, she knew there was no choice. Memories couldn't keep him warm. Honor couldn't save his life. Only fire could do that, and she was the only fuel they had. With trembling hands, Zara took off her outer robe and tore it into strips. Using 2 pieces of metal from the ship, she created enough friction to make the fabric smolder, then carefully blew on it until a small flame appeared. The fire was tiny at first, barely bigger than her thumb, but it was warm and growing. She fed more strips of fabric into the flame, watching her precious clothes disappear into heat and light. The fire grew stronger, casting dancing shadows on the walls of their broken ship. For the first time since the crash, Zara felt a tiny spark of hope. They had heat. They had shelter. They had each other. Maybe, just maybe, they were going to survive this. 3 days had passed since the crash, and Zara felt like she was living in a nightmare that wouldn't end. The small fire she had managed to keep burning was the only thing standing between her son and certain death. But with each piece of clothing, she fed to the flames. Her hope grew smaller. Koda had woken up on the 2nd day, groggy and confused, but thankfully alive. The bump on his head had gone down, and he seemed to be thinking clearly. But his body temperature was still dangerously low, and no matter how close she kept him to the fire, he couldn't seem to get warm enough. "Mama, why are you wearing so few clothes?" Koda asked, his young voice filled with concern. He had noticed that she was down to just her undergarments and one thin shirt. Everything else had been burned to keep their fire alive. Zara forced a smile as she adjusted the makeshift blanket she had created from salvaged seat cushions. "I'm not cold, my love. The fire keeps me warm, too." It was a lie, of course. She was freezing, but Koda's needs came first. They always came first. She looked at the pile of fabric next to their fire. Only a few pieces remained from their original clothing supply. Her ceremonial dress, the one she had worn when she graduated from the Science Academy with highest honors. A pair of soft sleep pants that had been a gift from her mother. And the scarf. The precious scarf that had belonged to Koda's father. Touching the scarf brought back a flood of memories. She remembered the day Varn had given it to her, nervous and stumbling over his words as he tried to express his feelings. It was made from the silk of rare moths that only lived in the mountains of their home world. The deep purple color matched his eyes perfectly. "This scarf will keep you warm when I can't be there," he had said, wrapping it gently around her shoulders. And it will remind you that love can survive any distance, any hardship. He had been right about love surviving hardship, but he hadn't survived the journey to Earth. The memory of his sacrifice still hurt like a fresh wound. He had stayed behind to fight off their pursuers, giving Zara and Coda time to escape. She never saw him again. Now she held his scarf in her hands, knowing she would have to burn it soon. The thought made her chest tight with grief, but she had no choice. Coda's breathing had become shallow again, and his lips were turning that dangerous shade of blue that meant his body was shutting down. "I'm sorry, my love," she whispered to the memory of Varn as she tore a small piece from the edge of the scarf. "But our son needs this more than I need the memories." The fabric caught fire quickly, burning with a bright flame that threw welcome heat into their small shelter. Coda moved closer to the fire, and some color returned to his face. But Zara knew this was only temporary. They were running out of fuel, and she still had no way to call for help. She had spent hours trying to fix their communication device, but without proper tools, it was hopeless. The circuits were fried, and even if she could repair them, the main antenna had been completely destroyed in the crash. They were truly alone on this strange world. Food was becoming another serious problem. They had managed to salvage some of their emergency rations from the wreckage, but it wouldn't last much longer. Zara had tried eating some of the plants she found growing nearby, but they made her sick. Earth vegetation was apparently not safe for their kind to eat. She had also tried to catch some of the small animals she could hear moving around in the forest at night, but they were too fast, and she was too weak from cold and hunger to be an effective hunter. Every day she felt herself growing weaker, less able to protect her son. The worst part was watching Coda try to be brave. He never complained about being cold or hungry. He helped her gather twigs and leaves to feed their fire. He even tried to cheer her up with stories and jokes when he could see she was feeling sad, but she could see the fear in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. "Mama," Coda said on the third night as they huddled together by their dying fire, "are we going to die here?" The question hit Zara like a physical blow. She wanted to tell him no, that everything would be fine, that help was coming soon, but she had always been honest with her son, even when the truth was hard to hear. "I don't know, my sweet boy," she said softly, pulling him closer. "But I promise you this. As long as I have breath in my body, I will keep you safe and warm. That's what mothers do." Coda nodded solemnly, accepting her words with the wisdom of a child who had already seen too much hardship. "I know, Mama, and when I grow up, I'll take care of you too." That night, as Coda slept fitfully beside the fire, Zara made a decision that broke her heart. She quietly took her graduation dress, the symbol of everything she had worked so hard to achieve, and began tearing it into strips. Each tear felt like she was destroying a piece of her past, but she had to think about Coda's future. The dress burned beautifully with flames that danced high and bright. For a few precious hours, their shelter was actually warm. Coda slept peacefully, his breathing deep and regular. Zara allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could survive one more day. But as dawn broke on the fourth day, she realized they were in serious trouble. The fire was dying again, and she was down to her last few pieces of clothing. Varn's scarf, her sleep pants, and the thin shirt she was wearing. After that, she would have to start burning pieces of the ship itself. The thought terrified her. The ship's interior was made of materials that might give off toxic fumes when burned, but it might also burn hot enough and long enough to keep Coda alive for several more days. It was a risk she might have to take. She looked at her sleeping son, so small and vulnerable, and felt a fierce determination rise up inside her. She would burn everything they had if necessary. She would tear the ship apart piece by piece. She would sacrifice anything and everything to keep him alive. Because that's what love meant. Not the romantic love she had shared with Varn. Though, that had been precious too. This was something deeper, stronger, more primal. This was the love of a mother for her child, and it would endure long after everything else had turned to ash. By the 7th day, Zara had nothing left to burn but the clothes on her back. She stood shivering in the cold morning air, wearing only her thin undergarments. Every piece of fabric they had brought from home was now nothing but ashes scattered around their small fire pit. Coda lay curled up near the dying embers, wrapped in the last salvaged piece of seat cushion material. His breathing was so shallow that Zara had to lean close just to make sure he was still alive. The blue tint around his lips had grown darker, and his small hands felt like ice even when she held them close to the fire. "Please don't leave me," she whispered, brushing his hair away from his fevered forehead. "I need you to stay strong just a little longer." But even as she spoke the words, Zara knew they were both reaching the end. She had already started burning small pieces of the ship's interior walls, carefully choosing sections that seemed least likely to release harmful gases. The metal panels burned slowly and gave off an acrid smell that made her eyes water, but they produced steady heat. The problem was that each piece she removed made their shelter less protected from the wind and rain. Cold air rushed in through the new gaps, making it even harder to keep the space warm. She was literally tearing apart their only protection to create temporary heat. It was like borrowing time from tomorrow to survive today. Her stomach cramped, with hunger constantly now. She had tried eating tree bark after seeing some of the local animals doing it, but it made her violently sick. Everything on this planet seemed designed to poison her kind. Even the water from a nearby stream tasted strange and left her feeling dizzy and weak. But the hunger was nothing compared to watching Coda fade away a little more each day. He rarely spoke now, saving his energy for breathing. When he did open his eyes, they seemed to look right through her, as if he was seeing something far away that she couldn't understand. "Mama," he whispered on the 8th morning, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. "I dreamed about Papa last night. He was calling to me from somewhere bright and warm." The words sent a chill through Zara's heart that had nothing to do with the cold. In their culture, dreams of deceased loved ones were often seen as a sign that someone was close to joining them. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let that happen. That day, she made a decision that she knew was probably crazy. She began tearing out larger sections of the ship's interior, including parts of the life support system that might have been repairable. Each piece she burned was another door closing on their chance of ever getting home. But home meant nothing if Coda wasn't alive to see it. The larger panels burned hotter and longer than anything she had tried before. For the first time in days, their shelter actually felt warm. Coda stirred from his half-conscious state and even managed to drink some water. Color returned to his cheeks, and he looked at her with eyes that seemed to focus properly. "You took off more clothes, Mama," he said, noticing that she had stripped down even further to avoid burning her last shirt. She had fashioned a crude covering from some non-flammable insulation material, but it barely covered her and provided no warmth at all. "I'm fine, my love," she lied, wrapping her arms around herself to stop the shivering. "The fire is keeping us both warm now." But privately, Zara knew she was in serious trouble. Her body temperature was dropping dangerously low, and she was starting to experience moments of confusion where she forgot where she was or why she was there. Sometimes she would find herself staring at the fire without remembering how long she had been sitting there. The hallucinations started on the 9th day. She began seeing Varn standing at the edge of their shelter, calling to her to come with him. She saw her mother bringing them hot soup and warm blankets. She even saw rescue ships landing in the forest, only to have them disappear when she tried to get Coda's attention. The worst hallucination was when she saw herself as a child, playing in the gardens of her family home while her parents watched, proudly. The vision was so real and so warm that she almost let the fire die while she lost herself in the memory. Only Koda's weak cough brought her back to reality in time to add more fuel to the flames. That night, a terrible storm rolled in. The wind howled through the forest like a living thing, and rain poured through every crack and gap in their damaged shelter. Their fire, which had been burning steadily for hours, began to sputter and smoke as water dripped down from above. Zara worked frantically to protect the flames, using her own body as a shield while she fed more pieces of the ship into the fire. Pit. But the wind was too strong and the rain too heavy. One by one, the flames began to die out despite everything she did. "No, no, no," she sobbed, trying to coax life back into the smoldering embers. "Please don't go out. Please don't leave us in the dark." But the fire continued to fade. The last piece of burnable material she had prepared was getting soaked by the rain pouring in from above. Soon, they would have no heat source at all. In desperation, Zara made a choice that she knew was probably their death sentence. She began, tearing apart the ship's main control panel, pulling out circuits and wiring that might burn. These components were toxic when heated. She knew that. The fumes they would create could poison them both. But without heat, Koda would die anyway, and probably within hours. Her hands shook as she fed the electronic components into the dying fire. They caught immediately, burning with strange colors and giving off smoke that made her throat burn. But they also produced intense heat that quickly warmed their small space. Koda stirred and opened his eyes, looking more alert than he had in days. "Mama, the fire smells funny," he said, his voice stronger than it had been all week. "I know, sweet boy," she said, pulling him as far from the smoke as possible while still keeping him near the heat. "Try not to breathe too deeply." As the storm raged outside and toxic smoke filled their shelter, Zara held her son close and tried not to think about what the morning might bring. She had burned everything they had. Their ship could never be repaired now. Even if rescue came, they might both be too poisoned to survive. But Koda was warm, and his breathing was steady, and for this moment, that was enough. She had kept her, promised to protect him for one more day. If tomorrow brought the end, at least they would face it together, and he would know that his mother had never stopped fighting for him. The morning sun filtered through the trees as Dr. Elena Rodriguez made her way through the forest, checking her research equipment for the third time that week. She had been studying the effects of climate change on local wildlife for the past 6 months, and this particular area always gave her interesting data about how animals were adapting to warmer temperatures. But today, something was different. There was a strange smell in the air, like burning electronics mixed with something she couldn't identify. And through the usual forest sounds of birds and rustling leaves, she could hear something that didn't belong. A faint crackling sound, like a campfire, coming from somewhere ahead. Elena frowned and checked her GPS device. There weren't supposed to be any campsites in this area. In fact, this part of the forest was completely restricted to researchers like herself, so who was making a fire out here? Following the sound and the smell, she pushed through a thick patch of undergrowth and stopped dead in her tracks. In a small clearing ahead of her was what looked like the wreckage of some kind of aircraft, but not like any plane she had ever seen before. The metal was a strange silver color that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, and the shape was all wrong, more like a teardrop than anything built by human hands. Smoke was rising from inside the wreckage, and as Elena got closer, she could hear voices. Quiet voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Her scientific training told her to be careful, to maybe call for backup before investigating further. But her human instincts told her that someone might be hurt and need help. She approached slowly, making just enough noise so that whoever was inside wouldn't be startled by her sudden appearance. "Hello?" she called out softly. "Is anyone in there? Do you need help?" The voices inside went silent immediately. Elena waited a moment, then tried again. "I'm a doctor," she said, which was technically true since she had a PhD in environmental science. "If you're hurt, I can help you." What happened next would stay with Elena for the rest of her life. A figure emerged from the wreckage, and it definitely wasn't human. The being was tall and slender, with pale blue skin and large, dark eyes that seemed to take up half of her face. She was barely clothed, covered only by scraps of what looked like insulation material, and she was shivering violently in the cool morning air. But what struck Elena most was the expression on the alien's face. It wasn't the look of a dangerous invader or some kind of monster from a science fiction movie. It was the look of a terrified mother protecting her child. Elena recognized it immediately because she had seen the same expression on the faces of countless animals she had studied when their young were threatened. The alien woman held up her hands in what Elena hoped was a universal gesture of peace. But she also positioned herself firmly between Elena and whatever was inside the wreckage. She spoke rapidly in her strange language, gesturing toward Elena and then back toward the ship. "It's okay," Elena said softly, the way she might speak to a frightened animal. "I'm not going to hurt you. I want to help." She slowly reached into her backpack and pulled out an emergency blanket, the kind that reflected body heat. Without making any sudden movements, she held it out toward the alien woman. The woman's large eyes filled with what Elena was sure were tears, though they were a pale blue color instead of clear. She accepted the blanket gratefully and wrapped it around herself, her whole body seeming to sag with relief at the warmth. That's when Elena heard the sound that broke her heart. From inside the wreckage came the weak cough of a child. Not a human child, obviously, but the sound of a young one in distress is the same in any species. The alien mother's face filled with panic, and she turned back toward the ship. "Your baby?" Elena asked, pointing toward the wreckage. The woman nodded frantically and gestured for Elena to follow her. Inside the destroyed ship, Elena found a scene that would haunt her dreams for weeks. A small alien child lay near a smoking fire pit, barely conscious and clearly very sick. The air was thick with toxic smoke from burning electronics, and Elena could immediately see that both mother and child were suffering from smoke inhalation on top of whatever other injuries they had. Elena's medical training, limited as it was, to treating injured wildlife, kicked in immediately. She pulled out her emergency medical kit and began working. First, she gave both aliens oxygen from her portable tank, something she carried in case she ever got trapped in a cave or underwater. During her research, the change was almost immediate. The child's breathing became easier, and some color returned to his pale blue skin. The mother watched every move Elena made with desperate hope in her eyes. Elena worked quickly, using hand gestures and simple actions to communicate. She cleaned their wounds with antiseptic wipes, gave them water from her canteen, and wrapped them both in emergency blankets from her research kit. She even had some energy bars that, while probably not ideal for alien digestive systems, were better than nothing. The most challenging part was figuring out how to communicate. The alien mother seemed intelligent and was clearly trying to explain something important. She kept pointing to the sky, then to her child, then making gestures that Elena interpreted as flying or traveling. After about an hour of careful pantomime, Elena began to understand the basic story. These two had crashed here from somewhere, far away. They had been surviving on their own for days, maybe weeks, burning whatever they could find to stay warm. The child was sick and getting worse, and the mother was desperate to help him. Elena made a decision that would change her life, forever. She couldn't take them to a hospital, obviously. The government would want to study them, and who knew what would happen then. But she could bring them to her research station, which was equipped with better medical supplies and communication equipment. Using gentle gestures and speaking in a calm, soothing voice, Elena convinced the alien mother to trust her. She helped, them both out of the toxic wreckage and supported them as they walked slowly through the forest toward her camp. The alien child was so weak that Elena ended up carrying him most of the way. He felt lighter than a human child his size would, but his body radiated an unusual warmth that told her his species probably had a higher normal body temperature than humans. As they walked, Elena found herself thinking about all the science fiction movies she had watched over the years. None of them had prepared her for this reality. These weren't terrifying invaders or wise beings with all the answers to humanity's questions. They were just a mother and child who had crash-landed on a strange world and were trying to survive. When they finally reached her research station, Elena immediately went to work making them as comfortable as possible. She set up a space heater to keep them warm, gave them more food and water, and used her satellite phone to order emergency medical supplies without explaining exactly why she needed them. That night, as the alien mother and child slept peacefully, for the first time in weeks, Elena sat by the window of her research station and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there was their home, their family, their whole world. And somehow, through pure chance, she had become the bridge between their world and hers. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She was going to do everything in her power to help them get home safely. 3 weeks had passed since Elena found Zara and Coda in the forest, and her small research station had become an unlikely home for the most unusual family she could have ever imagined. The alien mother, who had managed to teach Elena her name, through patient repetition and gestures, was remarkably quick at learning basic English words. Coda, despite his young age, seemed even faster at picking up the language. "Elena, friend," Zara said one morning, carefully pronouncing each word as she helped prepare breakfast. It was a simple meal of fruits and vegetables that Elena had, determined were safe for their alien digestive systems, but it felt like a feast compared to the desperate days in the crashed ship. "Yes, friend," Elena replied with a warm smile. She had grown genuinely attached to both of them over the past few weeks. Coda's curious nature reminded her of her younger brother, always asking questions about everything he saw, and Zara's fierce intelligence and protective instincts had earned Elena's deep respect. But Elena knew their time together was limited. Using her research equipment and some creative engineering, she had helped Zara repair enough of their communication device to send a signal into space. They were waiting now for a response from Zara's people, and Elena found herself feeling conflicted about what she hoped would happen. Part of her wanted them to stay. They had taught her so much about science and the universe that her own research had advanced by years in just a few weeks. Zara's knowledge of environmental systems was incredibly sophisticated, and she had shown Elena new ways of thinking about climate change that could potentially help save Earth's ecosystem. But another part of Elena knew that they needed to go home. Despite their apparent adaptation to Earth, she could see that both Zara and Coda were struggling with things that went beyond language and culture. The gravity here was different from their home world, making them tire more easily. The air composition wasn't quite right for their lungs. And most importantly, they were lonely for their own kind. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning when their makeshift communication device suddenly crackled to life with sounds unlike anything Elena had ever heard. Zara practically leapt across the room to answer it, speaking rapidly in her own language with tears of joy streaming down her face. The conversation lasted for almost an hour, with Zara sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, and sometimes speaking, so quickly that Elena couldn't even catch the rhythm of the alien words. Coda pressed close to his mother, adding his own excited chatter to the mix. When the communication finally ended, Zara turned to Elena with an expression of pure happiness. "My people," she said in her careful English. "They come. 2 days." Elena felt her heart skip a beat. 2 days. After weeks of uncertainty, they finally had an answer. "That's wonderful," she said, and meant it, even though she also felt a pang. of sadness at the thought of saying goodbye. But their happiness was short-lived. That afternoon, Elena's satellite phone rang with an urgent call from her research supervisor. Government agencies had detected unusual energy signatures in the area and were sending investigative teams. They would arrive tomorrow, and they were, asking questions about Elena's recent activities. Elena's blood ran cold. She had been so focused on helping Zara and Coda that she hadn't considered how their presence might be detected by Earth's monitoring systems. The communication device must have sent out signals that were picked up by military satellites or radio telescopes. Problem, she told Zara, struggling to explain the situation with the limited vocabulary they shared. Government people come tomorrow. They want to find you. Zara understood immediately. Her face went pale, and she pulled Coda close to her. Elena could see the fear in both their eyes, the same terror that must have driven them to flee their homeworld in the first place. That night, Elena made a decision that would change her life forever. She couldn't let Zara and Coda be captured and studied like laboratory specimens. She had to help them reach their rescue ship, even if it meant putting her own career and freedom at risk. Elena spent the night planning. She knew the forest better than anyone, and she knew exactly where government teams would set up their search operations. There was a clearing about 5 miles north of her station that would be perfect for a spacecraft to land, and Elena was confident she could get Zara and Coda there without being detected. The next morning, they packed light and left the research station before dawn. Elena led them through hidden paths that she had discovered during her years of studying the forest. They moved slowly to accommodate Coda's shorter legs and the lingering effects of his ordeal, but they made steady progress. Behind them, Elena could hear helicopters circling her research station. She tried not to think about what the investigators would find there, or what questions they would ask when she eventually had to return. They reached the clearing just as the sun was setting on the second day. Elena had never seen anything like what happened next. The air above them began to shimmer like heat waves, and then suddenly a ship materialized out of nothing. It was beautiful, made of the same strange silver metal as Zara's crashed vessel, but this one was smooth and perfect and larger than Elena had imagined. Figures emerged from the ship, and Elena watched as Zara ran toward them with tears of joy streaming down her face. The reunion was clearly emotional, with lots of hugging and rapid conversation in their musical language. Coda was swept up in the arms of what Elena assumed were relatives or family friends. But what surprised Elena most was when Zara came back, to her, bringing some of the other aliens with her. Through a mixture of English words and gestures, Zara explained who Elena was and what she had done for them. One of the aliens, who seemed to be some kind of leader or elder, approached Elena with something that looked like a small crystal device. Through Zara's translation, Elena understood that it was a gift, a piece of technology that would help her in her environmental research. "You save us," Zara said, taking Elena's hands in her own. "We not forget. We help your world, like you help us." Elena felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I couldn't just leave you there," she said. "Any mother would have done the same thing." As the aliens prepared to depart, Zara gave Elena one final gift. It was a small piece of fabric, part of the scarf that had belonged to Coda's father. "Remember us," she said simply. Elena watched as the ship rose silently into the night sky and disappeared among the stars. She stood in the empty clearing for a long time, holding the piece of alien fabric and thinking about everything that had happened. When she finally made her way back to civilization, Elena faced weeks of questioning from government agencies. But she stuck to her story. She had found the crash site empty except for some unusual debris. She had no idea where the occupants might have gone. The crystal device that Zara had given her turned out to contain environmental data that revolutionized Elena's understanding of climate systems. Her subsequent research papers made her famous in scientific circles, though she could never explain the true source of her breakthrough discoveries. Sometimes, on clear nights, Elena would look up at the stars and wonder how Zara and Coda were doing. She hoped they had found safety and happiness among their own people. She hoped Coda was growing up healthy and strong, using his special abilities for good. And sometimes, when she was working late in her laboratory, Elena would swear she could hear faint signals coming through her radio equipment, signals that sounded almost like a familiar voice saying, "Elena, friend," across the vast emptiness of space. She never tried to respond to these signals, knowing it would be too dangerous for all of them. But she treasured them anyway, proof that somewhere among the stars, a mother and child remembered the human woman who had helped them when they needed it most. The universe, Elena had learned, was vast and full of wonders. But the most wonderful thing of all was that love and kindness could bridge any gap, no matter how wide or strange it might seem.